Thank you for that introduction. I'm Alicia, and today I'm going to talk about our study where we attempted to use text messages to identify heightened suicide risk in young adults, specifically college students. So suicide is a leading cause of death worldwide. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. general population and second leading cause of death among young adults aged 15 to 24. In the U.S., there are more deaths by suicide than by motor vehicle accidents or homicide. To further hammer this home, there is one attempt every 38 seconds, and every day 100 people complete a fatal suicide in the U.S. The difficulty of suicide prevention lies in the fact that the signs often seem invisible. As a matter of fact, clinicians are no better than chance at judging who amongst their patients will go on to make an attempt. So think about that. Even the experts have a difficult time reliably predicting who and when someone is at most risk. So this creates an open challenge to evaluate tools that may be helpful. There have been a number of data-driven approaches to suicide research, and these approaches have primarily focused on identifying suicidal individuals versus non-suicidal controls, and used a variety of data sources. For example, they've used suicide notes, physician notes that are contained in electronic health records, responses to emergency room questionnaires, and a variety of social media platforms. As a research community, we have done an excellent job identifying who is at risk, but we're still struggling to identify when someone is most at risk. So that's the premise of our study. We want to know if we can take everyday communications, specifically text messages, and identify increasing risk states within an individual. So to do this, we recruited participants who had a history of non-fatal suicide attempts, because that is a leading risk factor for fatal suicide, and ran them through a lab-based study. Before I describe the lab-based study, we sent out a communication survey to the Department of Psychology's undergraduate participant pool. And the main objective of the survey was to try to figure out how students like to communicate emotional content. They overwhelmingly suggested they like to communicate and express themselves emotionally via text messages followed by Facebook private messages. I'm going to walk through our screening process for recruitment because it was done in multiple phases in accordance with our IRB protocol to try to protect participants. We started with the Department of Psychology's undergraduate participant pool, which was approximately 2,400 students. The first thing we did was survey in an online screen and asked the participants if they ever had a period of sadness in the past in which they had felt hopelessness. 62% of the participants responded that they had. Of those who responded yes, we followed up with a second screen and asked them if they had ever had thoughts of wanting to kill themselves, of which 600 said they had. You'll see a drop in numbers because not everybody replied to the second screen. We also asked if they had ever made a suicide attempt, of which 90 people said that they had. So people who said yes to both of these questions and consented for another follow-up, we followed up with a phone screen where this is where a psychologist spoke with the student to ensure their eligibility for our study. We wanted to know if they indeed had a confirmation of suicidal behavior, that they were 18 or older, that they thought they had data available and were comfortable sharing it with us, and they had little current suicide risk. And by this we mean no suicide plan or intent and a minimal desire to die, so that would be less than or equal to 5 out of a scale of 10. In the end, we ended up running 33 participants through our lab-based study, of which 26 of them had extractable data. We lost 7 participants due to either software errors in collection of their data, or they identified a suicide attempt that was further back than the phone or the data that was available on the phone. So this is what our lab session looked like. It was conducted by a clinical psychologist in training, a PhD candidate. And the first thing that we had participants do when they came in the lab was to download their data. And this is because we wanted to give them some sense of agency over their own data. So they downloaded their text messages, and this was part of a larger data collection effort. So they also downloaded their call history, their emails, their online search history, their Facebook data, and their Twitter data. The next part of the lab session consisted of a structured interview. And this is where the psychologist asked general questions about their history, as well as questions specific to the mental health episodes that they were going to identify, which I'll talk about in the next slide. At the end of all this, the participants went through a number of standardized questionnaires, some of which are listed here. There's more than what's listed here, but for some examples about their mental health history, their suicide history, mood, hopelessness, and perceived social support. Okay. Oh, my PDF looks different than my PowerPoint. Anyway, so this is how we asked them to identify their mental health episodes. We asked them to identify periods of attempt, ideation, and depression. For attempt, we asked them to identify a specific date as indicated by the circle, and then we backed that date out 2 weeks in accordance with previous suicide literature that said participants can start thinking about suicide 2 weeks beforehand. We also asked the participants to identify 2-week periods of ideation. So this means they had thoughts of suicide, but they did not make an attempt. And then about a lower risk period, which is depression, where they did not have any thoughts about suicide or make an attempt. We acknowledge recall bias is a huge problem, and so we allow the participants to look through whatever necessary to jog their memories, whether that's their phone history, calendars, social media, etc. Of course, we were concerned about the impacts of this lab study on our participants, so before this interview happened and afterwards, we asked them about their mood and desire to die, and fortunately, there were no increases in negative mood or desire to die. So in the end, we ended up with 26 participants that had extractable text message data. And that resulted in about 500,000 outgoing messages. And 140,000 of those messages occurred during time periods of self-identified depression or suicidality. For the purposes of this paper, we're referring suicidality as any period of ideation or attempt. We then took the text messages and rolled them up into daily increments. So that means any message that occurred in a day gets rolled up into one observation. So that leaves us with 528 observations or days of depression and 685 observation or days of suicidality. From there, we took the text messages and transformed them into something called term frequency inverse document frequency. For those of you who are unfamiliar, you could think of this as simply counting up words, the number of times a word occurs in an observation, and then kind of normalizing that by the number of times that word occurs in all observations. So this gets fed into a predictive model. For our purposes, we used a deep neural net, which had 5 hidden layers, 1,000 nodes per layer, dropout to avoid overfitting, and stratified cross-validation to maintain that class balance. The output labels were either depression versus suicidality. We also tried a very common dictionary-based approach that's used frequently in mental health studies and text mining called linguistic inquiry word count. But the performance wasn't well, and for the sake of time, I'm not presenting that, but it is in the paper. So on the top table, this is what our results looked like for that TF-IDF deep neural net. We were able to correctly identify suicidal days 81% of the time. However, we did have a 44% false alarm rate. So this means that if the day was actually depression, we incorrectly classified it as suicidal. So why did our performance suffer? If you look at the graph on the bottom right, you can see that as the number of text messages increase per day, the misclassification error drops significantly. That being said, we didn't feel it was appropriate to exclude a day that, say, only had 2 text messages, because if you were to deploy this in a realistic scenario, that's just not realistic. Another reason we think performance may have suffered is the informal language use. People often make up their own words when communicating with their friends, and they tend to add letters to emphasize the importance of a statement. For example, yes versus yes. So another thing that's very different than, say, electronic health record, or even I would venture to say social media, is that most people tailor their communication to the audience they're talking to. So, for example, how I might speak to my mother is probably going to be very different than how I speak to my friend. And I think that this is a little different than social media, where you're projecting out an image of yourself. Okay. So we do think that this is a proof of concept that this may actually work. That being said, we acknowledge that there are limitations to our work that need to be addressed before moving forward. First of which, that false alarm rate is not good. Some ways to improve that would be to exclude days with limited text. However, we don't feel this is realistic if you were to deploy such a classifier in the wild. You could also consider creating personalized classifiers, so that would be only looking at one individual's data. We think with the collection of more data, this could improve. That being said, running each participant took 2 to 3 hours apiece, so it's time and resource intensive. How can we get past this? Perhaps crowdsourcing data collection or testing hypotheses on publicly available data before lurching into a resource-intensive lab study. In the most idealistic scenario, we would love a prospective study. This reduces recall bias, it ensures data is available, it allows you to fuse multiple data sources with some pretty cool probably outcomes, for example, audio recordings from therapy sessions or sensor data, and it allows for better temporal prediction. That being said, we as researchers, as well as our IRB, did not feel comfortable enrolling actively suicidal individuals. In the future, we believe such a system could have utility as a passive monitoring tool, especially in the clinical context. For example, it could be used to assess suicide risk during outpatient treatment, or as part of an aftercare plan following discharge from hospitalization, or even an out-treatment program. The intervention would have to be decided between the clinician and the patient. If the patient was low risk, maybe it could come in the form of a supportive text message prompt. So say if there was a heightened risk alert, a prompt is sent and asks the individual if they need additional resources. If it's a high-risk patient, perhaps it's an automatic alert to the care team or family members. That being said, this type of work does not come without a host of ethical, legal, and practical considerations. First of which, who should be monitored and how do you obtain consent? Should parents be allowed to monitor children? Should the military be allowed to monitor veterans? Who gives consent for those people who have mental illness or are cognitively impaired? Who should be notified of alert? Is it most appropriate to notify the medical team or a family member or a friend? This is a big one. So currently, if your patient endorses active suicide intent in person, as a healthcare provider, you are legally and ethically mandated to intervene. What happens if the system indicates your patient is at risk? Does that same standard still hold? Another big question, many patients deny having thoughts before going on to make a fatal suicide attempt. What if the alert system says your patient is at risk, but your patient maintains they're not having thoughts? What do you do? And then finally, there are always trade-offs to be made in machine learning between false positives and false negatives. What are we more willing to risk? Do we want to capture the days of suicidal intent, or do we want to reduce alarm fatigue? So we're currently still working with this data set. We're looking at the Facebook private messages right now. There have been a number of challenges we've faced in the past and that we still have ahead. First of which, this is a small data set as far as machine learning community is concerned, but it's a very rich data set, and how do we handle that? We also have juggled with what is the most appropriate time window for an observation. Is it 6 hours, 12 hours, number of messages, a day? How much time does a clinician need to intervene? Should we be using metadata for predictors? We collected information on relationships. Perhaps we should be looking at number of messages sent and who they're being sent to. Another challenge is leveraging the time component given the constraints of our particular data collection. And as I mentioned, there are differing communication styles, not just between people, but even within individuals. We feel the research community would love for us to extract meaningful features, and how best to do that. And finally, how can you scale up without sacrificing that quality data collection? So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Toni Michel from Technical University Vienna. Thank you for the really interesting presentation. Towards the end, you mentioned a number of ethical challenges related with your project. And I was wondering, what are you doing to address those? I mean, you raised the questions, but what are kind of the concrete steps to answer them?
Yeah.
And how does that relate to ongoing development of the tool?
Right, yeah, so in our paper, we discuss it more at length, and that's where our collaborators in psychology have really stepped in to provide that ethics-based discussion. But it's something that I think Kai has recently made this statement that we need to consider all aspects of our work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Hi, Benjamin Johansen from the Technical University of Denmark. Thanks for your talk, very interesting. I was wondering, why did you decide to use a deep neural network?
Sure.
Considering the, I would say, limited amount of data, and did you compare it with other methods like a linear regression model or something like that?
Right, and we talk about this in the paper. Yes,
Okay.
we tried other methods like, for example, logistic regression or support vector machine. It just so happened that the deep neural network gave us a better boost in performance, but we would love to use a method that allowed us to extract the meaningful features. And that's something that we're looking into by combining the Facebook message data with the text message data to hopefully give us that boost in data observations.
Okay. And just a quick one, did you use back-of-work methods for extracting context and these things instead of the TF method?
Yeah, we did try bag-of-word methods, so like term frequency, TF-IDF, as well as word embeddings. We tried a number of things. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. Steve Whittaker, UCSC. So just talking about the machine learning. So I mean, I think there's this question of having more kind of declarative models is quite important, I think, from a scientific perspective. So you think that there's a diagnostic perspective, but there's also a scientific perspective about how we might better understand depression and suicide, which these types of models aren't doing for us.
Absolutely.
And this is actually unique data because it's kind of real time. So can you just speak to, I mean, you sort of covered, so if you use these maybe less effective models, are you getting insights that wouldn't be present from, let's say, doctor-patient interactions?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, yes, we are willing to take a hit to performance if it means we can extract those meaningful features, and that's something we're actively looking at with the Facebook private message data.
Right. So let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Thank you.